Hey, Dr. Salem.
Hey, Dr. Amos, great to join you again for another Sperm Meets Egg. This specific topic's going to be, I think, a really fun one.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to ICSI, it's one of those, powerful things that really helped us in the fertility world, right? I mean, it changed everything. I mean, literally, even I don't think most people realize this, even egg freezing wouldn't be possible without ICSI. Because sure, you can do the egg freezing, but how would you fertilize the eggs later? And
Right.
so there's so many things that come from it. But I think it'd be kind of confusing for patients because there are clinics out there that will do ICSI for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other clinics who, will be based off of certain parameters.
Yeah.
And so, I think what's going to be great about this, and hopefully a lot of people come on and ask their questions because I'm sure they have them,
Yeah.
is why do you need ICSI?
Yeah.
And, I think one question that would be really kind of interesting to answer is this idea of, how do people who get pregnant naturally need ICSI? And this is always an interesting one. I've seen people who get pregnant, no problems at all. Then they come to do gender selection and nothing fertilizes.
Yeah.
And so, I think, I don't know if you want to kind of give a little introduction and stuff to ICSI, and then what we can do is I'd love to play like a video so you can kind of explain it to people. And, hopefully we have people come on and ask questions, because like I said, that's always what makes the show more fun.
Definitely, definitely. And I think one of the great things about the field of reproductive medicine is that there are options and there's this shared decision-making space. And this is like one of those critical questions that always comes up. But maybe before we dive in, I thought I'd talk a little bit more about what ICSI is and where it came from. So, ICSI is the way we refer to it. It's spelled ICSI. It refers to intracytoplasmic sperm injection. And it's the process by which an embryologist will very carefully introduce a sperm directly into the egg. So it kind of, goes through let's call it that, the shell of the egg, just to use kind of layman's terms, and they put it into the middle of the egg so that the sperm can then fertilize the egg. When we talk about stuff in our field, a lot of times people think, oh my God, this was developed, 100 years ago or something like that, because, ICSI is so popular now. But believe it or not, ICSI was developed in 1992, in part by mistake, a little bit, based on the story of Dr. Gianpiero Palermo, who developed this technique. He developed it in Belgium, if I remember right, and very quickly brought it over, spread it around the world, and clinics around the world started using it almost immediately. And right away, we noticed that this was, a miraculous treatment for men with severe male factor, and that's really where it started. But it's actually, in some ways, been such a good, treatment that maybe we're almost overutilizing it. And I think you and I will probably talk about that a little bit today, and about why, why some clinics are 100% ICSI, pros and cons of that kind of a thing. And we'll talk about, obviously, the alternative of ICSI, which is natural insem. I don't know, maybe do you want to talk about conventional insemination for a minute, just to kind of show us the discrepancy there?
Yeah, I'd love to take the easy view of that. You got to do the hard one. I get to do the simple one, which is, from the very beginning, you think of it as just putting sperm on top of the egg. But in reality, there's a little bit more work to it. You have to take the raw sperm, you have to remove all the prostatic, the seminal vesicle fluid, and you also have to get rid of a lot of sperm. This goes back to that intro when I was saying that there are people out there who have normal sperm who get pregnant naturally, and then they go into something like IVF and they don't fertilize as well. And that's because when we take that sperm and we wash it and we clean it, we're trying to get rid of all the dead sperm. We're trying to get the best of the best sperm, and we do that through either a centrifuge, through a Zymod chip. But in the end, eventually we get this very high quality sperm that has a high concentration, good motility. And then what we do is we expose that to the eggs, and usually there are these little wells that have the eggs in them, and there's about 50,000 sperm we give to each egg, and then we culture it overnight, And then the nice thing is it can fertilize, and it obviously fertilizes naturally. And what's interesting about it is that when you go to do ICSI, you have to strip the egg first. You have to first find out, is the egg mature? You have to remove a lot of the granulosa cells around the egg. When you do standard insemination, you don't do that. Matter of fact, you can tell there's egg there, but you can't really see it because you haven't stripped the cells away. And so imagine if you had like a basketball, but it had weeds all over it, and it was just wrapped in grass. You go, I think there's a basketball under there, but I can't really tell. And so you have to take the grass off and go, oh yeah, it's basketball. It's not volleyball. And so the same principle when you're looking at those eggs, you can't really see the egg yet because you have all those granulosa cells around it. And so you have to strip those to find out if it's mature or not. And so the problem in that situation is that if it is mature, you can ICSI it. But if it's not, you can ICSI it, but it's not going to be as good. And you can't really wait until it's mature. You can wait a little bit, but there's a certain time frame when you have to ICSI it. Whereas when you do standard sim, you put the sperm there, and if later on at 4 p.m. the egg matures, it can fertilize at that point when it's ready. And so there seems to be some benefits in that situation. But overall, standard insemination is just a process of putting the sperm with the eggs, cleaning it, whether that's processing through a Zymot, through a centrifuge, through a swim-up method, and allowing it to happen naturally, which is what happens naturally every day. So when you have relations. When it comes to, what do you tell patients when they ask you, like, hey, should I do ICSI or should I do standard insemination? How do you explain that to patients?
Boy, that's the $1 million question here tonight, and I hope some of our our viewers come on and ask their nuanced versions of that, because I feel like I get a lot of versions of that exact question. The first thing is, I think, just like so many things in our field, it just needs to be personalized, right? Because everybody comes at this with a different set of variables. How good is the sperm? Have you had a pregnancy before? Is it a same-sex couple using donor sperm? Do we know if the donor sperm has a proven, pregnancy with IVF? All these things. So you can see there's a lot of, layers to it. But without going into every single layer, right up front, I talk about 2 buckets. I say, listen, you either have normal sperm or you have abnormal sperm. If you have abnormal sperm and you're going through infertility, I recommend using it. I recommend using it to try to optimize the fertilization rate. And I recommend using it because that's what it was designed for. ICSI was designed for, primary male factor. Now, the second bucket is the harder one. Do I use it if the sperm is normal? And that one's the one that's more nuanced. I don't like to paint with a broad brush. So I always say, there's pros and cons to using ICSI. For example, ICSI doesn't necessarily improve the fertilization rate among IVF cycles where we have normal sperm. Actually, a really good study showing it. And while it wasn't a statistically significant difference, there was actually a higher fertilization rate in quite a few studies with conventional INSEM when sperm counts were totally normal. So then, the obvious thing becomes, well, why don't we just do conventional INSEM always? Well, the flip side of that coin is sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And so you run into this issue of total fertilization failure. Oh man, that sounds bad. So what is that? That's when literally none of the eggs fertilize. The cycle's a wash. You got started, you went to retrieval, you did all the hard work, you went to fertilize, none of them fertilized. And you found out the hard way that that's probably where there's a problem. What's the risk of that? Well, different studies will say different numbers, but the number I tend to use is around 2%. There's about a 2% risk of total fertilization failure. So one way to think about that is, well, if you did, 50 patients, if you had 50 patients, one of them is going to have that outcome, and that's a really unfortunate outcome. But at an individual level, 2% is also a pretty small number. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you use different numbers for your statistic of total fertilization failure? Because there are different studies. I mean, what do you think about that, Dr. Amos?
Yeah, I actually did a podcast on this topic and in it about failed fertilization. And that's exactly right. 1-2% is kind of where it goes. And I think you brought up a really good point about this idea that, we definitely overuse ICSI. There's no question. And it's because of the fear of that failed fertilization is so great that there are times we use it when we don't need it. I'll give you an example. I have patients come to me from other countries. So they're coming from Canada or from China. Well, I know if they have a failed cycle, it's not like they just come back, a month later back to my clinic. Like, that's a huge expense. It's a huge amount of traveling. So there's times where I may say, listen, I don't think it's worth a chance. And so I will do ICSI. When it comes to rescue ICSI, I think this is where there's probably a bit of confusion. Is I think a lot of people think rescue ICSI is like ICSI. Now, I'll have patients say to me, well, I am doing ICSI in case they don't fertilize, and then you guys will do ICSI. And I try to explain to them, well, that's different. Rescue ICSI is not ICSI. The fertilization rates are poor. The quality of the embryos are poor. And the chances of success are going to be poor. And so I say the same thing as you. I put them into those buckets. And excuse me, I think, in general, I have like general rules. It's been changing over the years, right? So when I was with Mayo, if you didn't have 5% perfect sperm on the morphology, you did ICSI. I'm sure you've probably seen that too in your career. At our clinic, we started noticing we could go down and down. So now we go to 3%. So as long as someone has 3% morphology, we will not do ICSI. But there's so many other parameters. Are they moving well? And anytime I see something a little bit off, I'd rather do ICSI than not. If someone's done ICSI before, I will sometimes do it because I go, it worked in the past. Why would I change it now? And then all of a sudden something bad happens and they're gonna be like, why didn't you do what worked last time? Like I said, looking at travel, looking at the quality of the sperm. Another big one, I'm not sure if you do this one. I know this is kind of like my own mental science here, but I tend to, people who have unexplained infertility for a long period of time. Now, the studies, as you said, are absolutely true. Unexplained infertility does not show improvement with using ICSI. But what about someone who's been trying for 10 years and they've never got pregnant? Sperm's fine, everything else is fine. So in those cases, and this is kind of interesting, I'll even tell the patient, I said, listen, let's do half and half. By doing half and half, we can at least then, make sure. And so I had this patient just recently. There was just something didn't feel right. I didn't feel good about this case. And so I made the decision to do most of it ICSI, and I did like maybe 25% of it standard insemination. And thank goodness I did. That was the problem. Nothing fertilized from the standard sem. There wasn't even sperm attached to the eggs. So I think that's an important thing people understand. There's a difference of sperm being attached, not getting in, and sperm not even being attached. And that was the problem. Thank goodness, I guessed right, to do that. I talked to people about it with frozen eggs. I don't know if you talked to them about it, but I explained to them that there are some people out there who they're against ICSI. And so I make sure they know that if you're going to freeze your eggs, you really don't have an option later. You are going to need ICSI because of the zona pellucida being hardened. I'm sure I'm probably one of the few doctors to talk about, but do you talk about other situations where you would tell someone to use ICSI that wouldn't be the custom things? Like, obviously a TESI, PESA,
Right.
any type of surgical sperm,
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to mention those, like the surgically extracted sperm, right? That's one I feel like sometimes it catches people by surprise. And then I'm like, well, no, we have to use ICSI. This is surgically retrieved sperm. It hasn't gone through the same maturation process that ejaculated sperm has gone through. It's actually a different form of sperm, and we have to use ICSI for it. And people sometimes are a little surprised by that one. I think that the other one that I tend to consider sometimes is when we're doing like PGTM and thinking about, so PGTM being monogenic disorders versus PGTA, it gets a little nuanced because sometimes with PGTM, they're using what's called a PCR platform to do the genetics. Among other things, they use NextGen, may use PCR. But the long and the short of it is that there could be contamination in the genetic testing. If you leave a bunch of sperm on the egg, and even if only one gets in and fertilizes, it can cause some, cross-contamination. Now, the genetics labs, to their credit, have gotten better with this. And they used to, some of them require it for every kind of PGT. Now, that's not the case anymore, fortunately. And so I think that's a really great one. The other stuff is a little bit softer. So by the way, I wanted to go back to your point, Dr. Amos. 100% agree with you on the very long duration of infertility and using ICSI. I talk to my couples about this all the time. I just had a couple this week, and they were like, "Oh, we've only been trying for the last year." I asked them a couple more questions, and it turns out they've been married for 11 years and not using contraception, and they have sex, couple times a week, most of the time. And I was like, well, actually, in my world, you guys have been trying for 11 years because sperm has been in exposure to eggs, and you're ovulating, and we know there's sperm there. And it's very unlikely that you've just been that unlucky that for 11 years, everything is totally normal and the sperm has never entered into the egg. Now, this is a little bit more of the art of medicine, right? Because there's not a perfect study on this. There's not a study of among all people who have had infertility for 10 years, what's the rate of using ICSI and not using ICSI. So I have to admit, this is a little bit of a softer parameter. But how about cases in which we have very low numbers of sperm or vials of sperm?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, especially like with same-sex couples or people who have had, let's say, prior to cancer, froze some sperm, and you're down to, let's say, one vial. If you just thaw that whole vial, you're out of sperm. So by at least using portions of it, you can chip some off and thaw that portion and do ICSI, and now you have sperm for another future cycle. And that's a great example in that situation. Or I've had people where the donor's not available anymore, and so it's their last vial of sperm and things like that. I know we've been talking a lot about when ICSI is needed, but the interesting thing is when ICSI is not needed too. I think it's another part, and that's jumping in the donor sperm is one of those things. Is rarely do you need it with donor sperm, and so the question is, what's the harm, right? If you use donor sperm, you really shouldn't have to do ICSI. Now, if they thaw the sperm and it's poor quality, then in that situation, yes, you're going to still need to use ICSI. But if the quality is good and it meets normal criteria for a semen analysis, you could just get away with standard and SEM. on one of the things I talk to patients about is I find that depending on where they get their sperm from with donor sperm, sometimes the quality of it can be a little bit different, and sometimes we have to do ICSI more than we want to. And obviously, they would want us to do that because you wouldn't want to have failed fertilization. What are some other situations that that you would talk about with regards to where it's really not needed, and yet it's used all the time? And as you mentioned, it actually has a lower pregnancy rate, a fertilization rate, than actually doing standard for some people.
I worked at a clinic previously, so not the current clinic we're at, but I worked at a previous clinic where it was effectively 100% ICSI. So again, I feel like this is just an important one for people to know about. Like, is your clinic 100% ICSI clinic? Or maybe even, it's worth asking your doctor if they're recommending ICSI. Like, well, are you recommending it, but you never recommend the alternative? Then it's kind of like, okay, I know where this is going. There are some clinics that do it. I would say the rationale in those clinics is fair, but might be a little bit overly generalizing. So meaning the way they think about it is they're like, well, we never want to have a case of total fertilization failure that we can avoid. And so we're just going to adopt this policy as a clinic that we are always going to do ICSI. Maybe at the level of the clinic, that's a good decision because they will really minimize the level of these total fertilization failures. But sometimes for the level of the individual, that's not necessarily the right decision. And so that's it's a kind of a broad bucket, but where ICSI might not be, needed. And I want to make sure, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this, but the fact that, ICSI has some risks. Maybe that's the way you call a risk from risky. Yeah. So, I mean, what do you talk about on your end with, broadly some of the risks of using it? Because we talked about the risk of not using ICSI, but what are the risks of using ICSI?
Yeah, I was actually trying to show you, I wanted to bring up a video that I have of where an egg was ICSI'd, and then you could just see the content of the eggs coming out of the of the egg. As a matter of fact, I think I posted on a TikTok video one time. And, you know, it's interesting. People get so worried about biopsies where there's hundreds of cells and you take three to five cells. They don't get worried about sticking a needle into something that has one cell. It doesn't have any other cells to give up. And so there's definitely some risk. Now, you know, being done in the right hands, it's a lot lower risk because, you know, they're experienced. And obviously, as we've gone on over the years and we have needles made by, you know, the same companies, everyone's using the same things now. It's not like people are making their own. It's less risky. And so I tell people that the ones who need to be a little bit more nervous about ICSI are ones who have maybe fragile eggs. So women who are a little bit more mature, severe diminished ovarian reserve, sometimes their eggs will undergo atresia and die after doing ICSI. And so sometimes I'll say to them, listen, I would rather you just do standard INSEM so we don't have to manipulate your eggs a little bit. One of the things I have coming up here a little bit later is one of the other forms of ICSI with the piezo ICSI. And so it would be kind of neat to show people that they actually have, you know, new techniques coming out to even help reduce harm of the egg at that point. But I think there's another risk that we don't talk about, and that is the risk to cost. I mean, you know, we are very unique in our clinic that we don't charge that much for ICSI. But I mean, it's not uncommon for ICSI to be $3,000 added on, you know, or more. And so, you know, I think from that point, there's a lot of risk because if it's not benefiting you and you're actually getting a lower fertilization rate, I think you need to have justification to tell someone to do it. You know, it's kind of funny. I don't know if I told you this. When we first opened, we had no charge for ICSI. I didn't never want to charge people for ICSI, and we never wanted to. What happened is we didn't use ICSI on people who didn't need it. And we would get people who were upset with us when they would have 100% fertilization and we didn't use ICSI. And I couldn't understand it. They're like, they were so mad. Why didn't you use ICSI? I'm like, well, you had 100% fertilization. Why does it matter? You didn't need it. Well, because I would have done it if I didn't know it was going to be used. And we were so shocked by it, you know, because we thought, well, we're always going to pick what's best for you, and we're gonna be behind it if we pick the wrong one. But regardless, you know, when they said to me, go, well, it doesn't cost anything. Why not do it? And I'm like, well, it does cost something. We just don't charge for it. And so what was interesting is when we started charging even that small little amount, people didn't want ICSI anymore. And so it just shows you that that's a small amount. So for other people who are spending, you know, thousands on this ICSI, I think that's a risk because they may not need it and they're worried about something, and their doctor should tell them, like, you really shouldn't be that worried. But on the same token, if you're paying $15,000 for IVF, then you're going, okay, wait, well, $3,000 more, maybe it's worth doing ICSI to at least guarantee I get fertilization versus, as you said, having that 1% to 2% complete failed fertilization.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's, you know, when we think about the big picture of it too, it's a huge cost on our healthcare system. I mean, we don't talk about this too often, and it's not really the main topic of our conversations here. But, you know, when we talk broadly about this kind of stuff, for all the sort of less than necessary cases of ICSI, that is costing the healthcare system, you know, a lot of money. And, you know, those things over time get patched in. I mean, and you're right. The average cost for ICSI, I believe, around the country is somewhere between $1,500 on the low end and $3,500 on the higher end for average cost of ICSI as an add-on. But again, I mean, your philosophy around it is mirrored by, you know, healthcare systems where people don't pay anything for all of IVF and ICSI and everything, and they get it only when it is quote unquote needed. And I think there's almost less speculation about it in those places, like in Europe, for example, where in a lot of healthcare systems where your IVF might be fully paid for, it doesn't come standard except if you need it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have a video of ICSI, and I thought it'd be kind of neat for us to kind of like play this, you know, video and kind of describe to people like what's going on, because anyone can watch a video, but, you know, kind of understanding what's the real idea behind these things. And so let me pull this up. And while I'm pulling this up, there was a question someone asked, which was, you know, what are the criteria needed for ICSI to be recommended with InvoCell. And so after this video, I think it would be a kind of interesting to go over. But let me add this to the stage, and you know, you can jump in here too. I mean, right now you can see that little sperm's trying to get away, and what they're doing there is so it can't move away. They're nicking the tail, and then they're pulling it up into the needle. And I've seen people actually, you know, where they'll actually pull it up head first, and their idea is that there's less fluid going into it. But most people do it this way, where they pull it by tail first. And then what they're doing now is changing the magnification and getting to the point where they can get the egg on the pipette there and holder. And then once that gets there, what they're doing is now aligning the egg. And that's because there are special mitox spindles that can, microtubule spindles, that if you accidentally hit with a needle can cause harm. So they're purposely putting the polar bodies at either the 6 o'clock or 12 o'clock position. And then I'll let you go from here, Dr. Sandler, if you want. You can kind of tell them what's happening next with this needle and why they're doing what they're doing. Do you want? I think you're on mute, though.
They're effectively pinning the egg down with the what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen, and now they're going to go through that outer shell of the layer, the olema there, and then they're going to put the sperm, boom, right. They're going to just.
I'm gonna pause it right here. So I want people to see this. This is really neat. Like as you're saying here, this is basically the layer where you're going to the olema, as you mentioned. This is the zona pellucida that's there. And you know, what's really interesting, if you notice, the sperm is at the very tip of the needle. And that's the very important part, because that is going to, you don't want to just push a bunch of fluid into it. So you want to put very little of the fluid, the media from the sperm, into the egg. And so then, I'll let Dr. Sam go back to what's going to happen next.
Yeah, and so they're going to go right into the egg. They're going to drop a little bit of the fluid from the cytoplasm of the egg here, and then they're going to inject all of it all together now, so that the amount of volume, the exchange of volume, is nearly, you know, net zero. And now the cytoplasm of the egg surrounding the sperm right there, and then they finish the fertilization process, or I should say, they finish the ICSI process, hoping for the fertilization to go from there. But yeah, what else would you add there? I wish we had an embryologist on with us. I'm sure they could give more.
I'm sure there's someone around who could probably get it, you know, and can probably do a better job than us, you know. But it's interesting, like those little things, the little nuances, like why are they pulling up the fluid from the you know, cytoplasm? It's to break that ulema. You know, you have to break that for that to work. And so it's going to be kind of neat when we talk about the other stuff. What it looks like from the embryologist view is they have this very small, tiny needle. You can barely see the tip of it with your eyes. And then they have the holding pipette. And so they're not really at an angle like this, but instead they end up kind of going flat, so that they almost have like I can't bend my finger that far. If I could, you'd be able to see it. But anyways, it goes down and then it's bent. And that allows it then to be on the surface of the dish. So it's, like I said, what you see is a little bit different than what they see. I think one thing that'd be really cool for us to go over, and I think this is sometimes missed, is this idea behind PNs, right? So, you know, when you fertilize these eggs, you know, we come back and then we look during a window of where we expect the pronuclei to show. And that's going to let us know, did it fertilize normal, did it fertilize abnormal? And what we're looking for is, this is what is called a 2PN. So what you can see here is this is the pronuclei, there's the other pronuclei there. And that tells us everything is going good. But there are times that is different. And so one of the things with ICSI is that if you put a single sperm into the egg, then you at least know there's only one piece of DNA from the egg. Now, there are situations where the head can technically have two pieces of sperm in it, but in general, you can say, okay, if there's now more than one, or there's less than one PN, then there can be problems. So What do you tell patients, when they get abnormal FERT? So here's normal FERT, but let me pull up one that's an abnormal FERT that can happen at times. What do you tell patients about that when you see a 1PN, and what does that mean? And obviously a very big polar body there too.
Yeah, so I mean, the whole concept of two pronuclei is, of course, that uh, the nuclear material, the DNA, is coming together from the sperm and from the egg, and then they're fusing together. And as that process is fusing together, you're seeing the two pronuclei, and then of course they'll start the division process afterwards. So a 1PN is effectively, in the case in which, by and large, now again, there are some exceptions to this, the fusion did not happen. So the sperm just didn't establish its ability to then kind of open up its DNA, let's say, and start fusing with the nucleus of the egg, and that, those 23 chromosomes from the egg. Again, just a very quick crash course. Sperm brings 23 chromosomes, and egg brings 23 chromosomes, and then they come together to form 23 pairs of chromosomes. And of course, eventually that's what we'll be doing PGT-A on in most cases, and that's how we get to that, that count, the 23 pairs of chromosomes that we're looking at. But in this case, yeah, it doesn't look like there was a fusion event, or the kind of the presentation of one of the nuclear DNAs. But maybe you have a better way of explaining it to the patients. I don't know. I didn't love my way of explaining it. How would you say it?
I mean, here's another one that show, a 3PN. I think the thing what I wanted people to understand is that, there's this idea of fertilization, which just means that it underwent the last stage of meiosis and made two polar bodies, and that's fertilization. But the problem is, if it's not normal fertilization, there's concerns. So, for example, in this situation where there are 3 pronuclei, the concern is that you could have 3, basically pieces of DNA, and you have a thing called triploidy, where instead of, as he was saying, 23 chromosomes, you normally have 46 when you have 2, when you take the 23 and 23 together. But now if you add another 23 onto that, now you have 69. And so in the situation where you have the 1, that's the 2, this is the 1, and you have the 1 on there, then that means it could be missing, and the whole thing could be monosomy, where you're missing an entire, every single chromosome is missing one. So it's important to understand that just because you get fertilization doesn't mean you're always going to have, a healthy embryo. And what's interesting is that before, in the past, we used to discard those. So if you had a 1PN or a 3PN, discard it. And then what happened when PGT came around, people said, hey, we can start keeping these, and maybe we can, find if there's anything wrong with them. But the issue came up is that with next gen sequencing, you can't see some of these, because when you're looking at everything is normalized. So what that means is that you're taking the values of all these data, and then you basically divide it by itself. And so if you have 3 of everything, and you say, okay, is anything higher or lower, and you divide by itself, everything's going to look like 1. And then you're not going to see anything above or below. So there's a thing called SNPs now that they add to them, and now we can see these triploidies. And so you can now keep these embryos. And I think there was just a recent article not too long ago about 1PNs and how it's not unreasonable to keep them, and that they can even work. That was even without PGT, but with PGT, it could even be a little bit better. So I just thought it was good for people to see that. There's another thing I thought would be really cool. And this is, kind of where are we going with ICSI? Like, right? Because the question is like, what else do we need to do? So one thing that's come out was the Zymon chip. And, I think this is kind of an interesting device, because in the past, whenever we did any type of processing and we put the sperm in, we were just picking it after putting it through a gradient and stuff. And so the Zymon chip, what's really unique about this is by putting the sperm in this, and then we're allowing microfluidic channels, which are these tiny little channels the sperm have to fly through. Well, I should say swim through. Then when we extract the sperm, we're able now to get sperm with pretty much, almost 0 DNA fragmentation. And that can help people who have, let's say, real reasons to need ICSI. So for example, if you have, poor sperm quality and you need ICSI, this can actually make it better. And so I thought it would be kind of neat to kind of touch on a couple of these. The other one I thought would be really interesting to go over is this piezo. So we talked about ICSI, but there's this new ICSI needle called piezo. And what's interesting about this, and I don't even think it's FDA approved yet, so I don't think many people are using other than research settings this time, but everything looks the same, as you can see. But if you notice, there's not a pointy tip. And yet what you're going to see here is this thing goes through like it's a blade sword or something, just right through this. And it goes right into the egg. And then watch this, which is going to be really interesting. You're going to notice that they get the sperm ready. So they went through the zona. They get the sperm right to the tip. They go in, they put sperm out, and they come out. No sucking up of the cytoplasm. Now, why? Because what's unique about this pipette is that it vibrates, and these little tiny vibrations make it sharp and go right through the zona, right through the ulema, as mentioned before. And you don't have to pull the cytoplasm because you're breaking the ulema. And so there's less trauma. And what they found is with this is that you actually do have better fertilization. And so, what we're seeing is even though ICSI was amazing, we're doing all these things now to try to improve it more. And I even got this other video I thought was really cool where it actually shows like the difference between these two. And you can see how on the ICSI, they have to pull the cytoplasm up to break the ulema, whereas with the piezo, it just goes in and out. And so, again, this is more, future of ICSI is even get better and better. And the fertilization rate for the piezo is around 85% to 90%, whereas the ICSI is, 70, 80%. So like I said, there's a lot of improvements coming out there for ICSI and things like that. I know we have Steve in the background. I'm really excited to talk to him because we haven't talked to Steve in a while. I don't know if Canada has allowed him to talk to us or what, but we haven't spoke to him a bit. So I'm looking forward to talking to him.
Hey, how you doing? Dr. Amos, Dr. Selim?
Great to see you.
Fantastic.
Yeah, no, I there were a couple nights I wanted to jump in, but I promised my wife we would have our streaming show session, so I had to pass this.
Of course.
It's 9 to 9:30 here, so this is prime streaming time in the Rooks household. But tonight I managed to get the we're going back through Parenthood. We never actually saw that series, and just diving back in. But I appreciate you always pulling me in. And actually on this one, as you probably know, I'm always advising a lot of different startups. And an interesting one related to this is a startup that is reviving some research on sperm hyperactivation, going through capacitation and then to hyperactivation just prior to fertilization. And the original work that they're building on, the study size was too small, so they didn't have a significant result, but it showed a 24% increase in high quality blasts. And this was in humans. It wasn't just in mice or bovine or whatever. And so they're now in the process of going back through to do a larger study, starting in Japan, but we're looking to do something in the US as well too. But if you got a 25% increase in high quality blasts by improving the fertilization process, both IUI, conventional IVF, and ICSI, that would be something.
Yeah, I think I saw that, and I think it was kind of running through the groups. I think the biggest part, the problem with it is the amount of time it took. Mm-hmm. It added on a significant amount of time. Yeah. A lot more, perhaps from that standpoint. And so, but yeah, I saw that. I thought it was really cool. And remember, the first thing I was thinking is, oh, wow, we should try this. And then I saw how much, more time it takes to do.
Yeah, they're working on that. And they've managed to split in a way that you can process the sperm while you're processing the oocytes, so that it's done in parallel and you're not necessarily wasting time to get into whatever conventional whether you're doing conventional IVF or ICSI. The thought, though, is that it'll be even more even more beneficial for conventional IVF to improve that. But it also works with IUI as well, too, to potentially increase that. So they're doing a large enough study to ensure that we can truly see whether or not we're getting this kind of lift in either fertilization on the IUI side as well as on the IVF side.
We were talking a little bit earlier about, places that, let's say, things are covered under, insurances in Canada. And again, I don't know Canadian IVF cycles, but do you find their ICSI is a lower rate than we see here in
a little bit, but it's still up around 85%. I mean, overall. Wow. So I think there's a little pushback now. I think there was a swing one way, and now the thought is, given some of the raises, that what percent of non-male factor do you really need ICSI, et cetera? Because the upcharge here in Canada tends to be around 1,500. Well, that's Canadian, so that like $1,000 US. So it's not as expensive, but it's still an upcharge typically for ICSI.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just say them. Did you see that? I think it was like on LinkedIn. I saw some of the stuff going around about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mean about the startup or about
putting the sperm like just inside the zona, and then like you allow it naturally to go, but you're just kind of getting it past the wall.
I actually have a picture here if you want to see it.
Yeah, if you can show it, that'd be great. Yeah, I thought
I'll bring it up here.
I didn't even think about that one when I was getting all these videos and stuff, and I forgot about that one. That's a really, really new thing that's coming out.
Yeah,
there you go.
On Pixie.
I don't know if you can see that. I mean, whether it's showing, but I just put it up on there.
I can put it on the stage here.
Yeah. So you can see the needle coming in here, just touching the zona there, and it's held there for 10 seconds for the sperm head to adhere to it. So it's even less invasive than ICSI. But the researchers who did this a FERT insert for 2025 said that they see it as an alternative to rescue ICSI when conventional IVF has failed, like on day one or something like that.
Interesting.
It's very interesting. And I mean, I think, at a broader level, to all the viewers, to everybody, watching here, is this idea of, we were getting, better and better, of course, at, identifying the egg and taking care of the egg and all of that. I think where we still have some work to do is the sperm.
Yeah.
Many times in an IVF cycle, we have the option of millions of sperm, and it's very difficult to select 15 or 20 to pair them up with the eggs. And so we kind of go back to these, what we know about sperm selection, but the reality is we're still not extremely precise in selecting sperm. And then this idea, of course, of, hey, could we get better fertilization rates than just plain old ICSI and conventional insemin? It looks like the answer is yes. This is coming in the very near future. Could really improve the efficiency of IVF cycles.
Actually, to that point, as you well aware, Conceivable and their work with the automation in the lab, their setup for sperm selection is they're using AI to select and track the top 3 or 4 best sperm in the field of view, and then they immediately fire a laser to trim the tail. So they're always getting, because this is one of the things, like even if you had an AI selection system, it's hard to track that sucker down to get the exact one that it recommended. But once they do that, then they're also using Physio ICSI in their fertilization. Now, again, you're looking at, it's not going to be ready for prime time until next year. It's being used right now in Mexico, but it shows promise.
In the past, they used to actually do ICSI. That was one of the ways, is just going in and releasing into that area. And what's interesting is that in that study, it's not just putting the sperm there, as you mentioned. It's this preparing the sperm. It's activated. And this is the difference, because in the past when we used to do it, we would just put the sperm into that little area and we wouldn't go in the cytoplasm. But that one is, as you said, activating the sperm. You actually have it attached and then you come out. It really is, interesting. And like I said, the only thing against it is just the amount of time it took. It was a lot more work. Sperm had to be processed, all the different things. But in the end, I mean, where that would be useful is, that, and I think this is the thing that people always have to understand, is that someone who has unexplained infertility that, can go through and get 25 eggs and 20 become fertilized and everything, you wouldn't use that, but you have someone who, like one of the patients of mine who I actually see, sending out messages how she's went through 10 cycles and haven't had success, and let's say part of it was a sperm problem and, they were barely ever getting embryos. This would be perfect for that.
Yes.
But the interesting thing here is, and this is where I feel like sperm gets such a pass, Dr. Salem. You were talking about this before, that I feel like we don't put enough focus on sperm. So one question that came up was, if there's low fertilization and you used ICSI, does that indicate that it must be like an egg problem? And the answer is no. ICSI doesn't make them fertilize. It can still be a sperm problem. And so, and the question is, how much damage are we doing when we do ICSI? I mean, when you look at where we started and where we are now, we've already done better. And so the question is, yeah, I think there's still more that needs to be done on the sperm side.
Yeah. One thing I want to bring up also quickly here, because we're talking about automation, we're talking about all these things, but I don't want us to forget the incredibly important role that the technical skill of the embryologist plays.
Yeah.
So I'll give a little anecdote, and that's that when I went through fellowship, I was lucky enough to get to, on eggs that were not going to be used, practice some of these skills. And it's incredibly difficult. And, as IVF doctors, we're not in the lab actually putting the sperm into the egg, of course. And that's the embryologist role. And they do thousands and thousands of these per year. And of course, the more that they do, generally speaking, the better they are to a certain extent, to a certain point. And I think that one thing that we've learned over time is that there is variation, and you can have a group of people who does a very, very good job and another group who's not so good. And so there is this variable, and not all ICSI is created the same.
Mm-hmm.
They let me try it, and I tried it, and yeah, it's not as easy as it looks. I was like, oh yeah, I'm good at video games. I'm awesome at Fortnite, right? So I'm gonna have to be good at this. And I really am awesome at Fortnite, in case anyone was wondering. That is actually true. I'm very good at Fortnite. I will beat you in the 1v1. But anyways, back to that point, I did ICSI, and I mean, I look like I have no clue what I'm doing. They were showing me, and I'm like doing it, but I did it, and it was on a practice one, so it wasn't like, for a patient, but I killed it. So it didn't work.
I couldn't agree more. Every time I walk into the embryology lab and to see them do their, like somebody who's really good at immobilizing sperm and then selecting it and put it, it's incredible to watch.
Yeah, we're learning now that embryos really matter, and I'm not saying that like, of course they matter. I mean, they don't get any of the credit, but they're doing everything. But what I mean is, and we're starting to realize that mosaicism could be your embryologist, the way they do biopsies, your fertilization rate. If you have people who have fragile eggs. So I mean, these embryologists, like I said, they are amazing what they do, and they train, and like I said, it really makes a big difference. I think that's where some labs shine over others, is their embryologists. I know we are very fortunate to have the ones we have. So,
yes, your results speak for themselves.
Steve, thanks so much for coming on, man. I always appreciate it.
Yes, always love coming on, and I always love your show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of questions I wanted to go over. I thought that would be good for us to touch on. One person asked, and I guess this is a perfect situation of education that we can do, is, when you put on your consent, a lot of the consents will be like, do you want ICSI? Do you not want ICSI? And there'll be one that will say, no ICSI unless the team thinks you need it. What do you tell them? Like, how would you explain it to someone? Like, because I think a lot of people think it's, if it doesn't fertilize, we're going to do ICSI. And so that's kind of the question they were asking on that.
Right. It's a great point. And I think, you're right. In some places, they just force you to decide, at that point, you're either doing ICSI or no ICSI. And I think that, that third category is one in which we try to be as objective as possible, and using the combination of objective data from the semen analysis that is done that day. So real-time data, as well as like the best judgment of your physician and embryology team. I think it's a very, very good, way to do it personally. Obviously, you and I both think that because that's the way we do it. But it also does create a little space for some patients to be confused about it. And I think, the clarifying point here is you're just saying, hey, you guys, I trust you. I trust that you'll do what's in my best interest. Just please do that. It's not you absolutely won't use ICSI or you absolutely will use ICSI. It's also not guaranteeing an outcome. We'll use our best judgment and everything. We still might have a poor outcome. But how about you? I mean, how do you unpackage that?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I tell them, is that our goal is to make sure they have the best chance. And so what we do is we do a semen analysis on the day if we're going to do standard insemination. And so at that time, if we see something wrong, the motility is low, the morphology, we actually used to not do morphology. And every once in a while, we'd have like a bad FERT, even though everything looks so good. And so I talked to one of my good friends, Doug Chobo. He's at Advanced Fertility Care, and he's one of the embryologists there, great embryologist. And he said to me, "Well, we do a morphology." And I said, "You know what? This was very early on in our, when we started. I said we're going to do that too." And it creates a lot of work, but we did that. And after doing that, rarely do we get failed FERT. And honestly, I truly think, like, I could probably say our failed FERT is probably less than 1% at our place, but that's because, if you do all ICSI, then it's always less than 1%. But I think, if you really look at it and you do all these little things, you can help prevent it. And so, I do think it's trusting the team. We only want what's good for you. There's nothing that we want than to have to tell you that, oh yeah, nothing FERT. And that's the worst thing. So, we're always going to pick what's best for you. I think, one thing that'd be good for us to touch on is this idea also about, when they read the consents, a lot of times it talks about how ICSI can pass along issues. And so, I always like joke around and say, my sons are probably gonna have problems with their sperm because I had problems and I wouldn't have kids if it wasn't for ICSI. And so it's possible now that I'm gonna pass along that problem. And I think that's the last thing we probably, before we end things here, kind of going off on is, how do you talk to patients about this idea? Like they get worried that, well, you're picking the sperm. You're not letting, nature pick sperm. Like, is my kid gonna have problems? And what does this mean when it says certain things can get passed along?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, part of this, I want to just like take a step back too, is to just talk about how difficult it is to study some of these things. When you think about the risks with IVF, it's not fair to compare a couple that has struggled with fertility for 10 years to a couple that got pregnant in 1 or 2 months. They have probably underlying things that led them to infertility that may be associated with also having these increased risks as well. And so I always tell people, the better comparison is to compare to other folks going through infertility treatment. Now, it doesn't always have to be IVF, but it could be another infertility treatment. I do talk about an increased risk with ICSI among some congenital anomalies. It is a small increase. So when we talk about congenital anomalies, we talk about 1 to 2% baseline risk, and then this might increase it by another 0.5% to 1%. So then we're talking about the difference between 1 and 2% or 2 and 3%. And those numbers seem fairly small, especially for all of us who, are trying to have children. We say, okay, it's worth taking that risk, from 2% to 3%. There are some things that seem to be maybe a little bit higher with ICSI, but I also go back to this idea of we studied ICSI and the outcomes of ICSI from a group of men who had really low sperm counts. And so they were more likely to pass on some of the genetic things there than, guys who had perfectly normal sperm counts. I mean, just to use a very, vague example, I'm bald. If I had sons, they'd be pretty highly likely to be bald too, and I'm just passing that down. That's part of my genetics, just like infertility is part of one's genetics, and you may pass on some subcomponent of that down as well. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, in my personal view. But I don't know. What's your take on that?
Well, my take is I think you make bald look good. So just so you know that. Exactly what you said. I mean, that's exactly what I tell patients is that, yes, there's 1% absolute 1% increase in things like birth defects, things like that. And, there's still that idea of association versus causation, and so I still think there's a lot to be learned about it. But in the end, exactly right. It's either not have a kid or take that small risk. I'm going to take that risk every time. The other thing I think would be interesting for us to talk about for a second, I know we're getting near the end here, but the idea that, why is it, as I mentioned in the beginning, that someone can have normal sperm, let's say, get, pregnant naturally, and then have failed fertilization. And the thing I always tell people, and I wonder how you explain it to people, is I say to them, there's nothing natural about what we're doing with IVF. When you talk about someone having intercourse, the amount of sperm that actually get to the egg by the time it goes through everything is maybe like 50 sperm. That's millions to 50. That's like, instead of taking high school players and saying how many make it to NBA, that's like talking every baby on earth and then make it to NBA. And so you're getting the best of the best. But when we do IVF, as we talked about, we're putting around 50,000 concentration of sperm per egg. There's going to be some bad ones in there. And so this idea that why can it happen naturally but not happen in the lab is because it's not the same. We're not putting the best of the best sperm there like it would be naturally. And so that's kind of an interesting thing you can see when you see failed for people who've got pregnant naturally before. Any other? I know there was one more question I wanted to get on to about the why do we use ICSI with IVC? But before I finish that, any other things you think that people might want to know, a little tidbits? And by the way, there are people on there saying bald is beautiful, so I just want to make sure you know. I agree. That's why I love having Dr. Salem on here.
Yeah. I can't. Yeah. So I would say overall, I think just as a parting thought with the risks to ICSI, I think you should know about them. But I also think, in my opinion, there are risks very worth taking on. Having a child is a risk. Yep. We don't live in a world where you can eliminate every risk when you have a child. Actually, there's a lot of risks that still exist. In a odd way, maybe that's what makes it beautiful too. Is that we kind of don't know what is going to happen, and we will love them all the same no matter what. So I think sometimes people can get really caught up in some of these things and say, oh my God, there's a 1% increased risk of having, hypospadias or having a congenital anomaly or this, or there's a 1 in 5,000 risk of these epigenetic disorders. And I say that may be true. And I say, but we have to accept some element of risk, and that's inherent with any medical treatment.
Yeah. And it's like I said, at some point someone has to choose the sperm, right? And at some point someone has to, we can get as good as we can, but at the end of the day, still there's human, they're going to pick the best they can. And until someday we can figure out, how we can look at the DNA in sperm before picking it. Those are the small risks we have to take, but they are very small compared to the risk of not having a kid. That's for sure. Any parting words then?
I think I'll make those my parting words then.
Perfect. Well, it was great talking to you again tonight. I think this was a really, great show. Like I said, I think we don't talk enough about sperm and its part. I feel like every single woman takes the blame. I'm right on their shoulders. I've made jokes about this before, where people come in and go, well, he's had a kid before. I'm like, you had a kid before. Why is it why is it your fault? And so I think it's, it really is important people know it's half the problem. And even when you have an issue, there's still going to be a sperm problem. It's possible to have both. So anyways, great talking to you, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks.
That sounds great. Looking forward to it. Yeah, this was a great one.
Have a good one.
You too.
So, got the knowledge, the power to grow. Sperm meets egg, let the healing flow. Further rounds, we explore. Life's a journey, so much in store. Got the knowledge, the power to grow. Sperm meets egg, let the healing flow. Step in, let's talk about the facts. Women's health, let's watch how it cracks. Cycles turning, it's more than just chance. In this moment, we're taking a stance. Voices rising, we're breaking the mold. Deep conversations, we're watching them fold. From the roots to the stars is one and the same. Empowered together, we're winning this game.